In this lesson, we're actually going to create a VPN connection. Now, previously, I actually requested a certificate for both the client and the machine. Now, depending on which option we select, we may not need that. But it lets us do that mutual authentication between the client and the server. So it just gives you the most flexibility, but you do require a PKI environment. So I can say, run the Getting Started wizard to very quickly set up both direct access and VPN with the standard recommended settings. Or you can have a bit more granular control. So I'm going to do the more granular way and say, run the remote access setup wizard. For this case, I'm going to say deploy VPN only. But note, it is recommended to deploy direct access at the same time. But I want to cover that in a future module. So I'll say deploy VPN only. And essentially now it's fired up the routing and remote access console. So I can expand out my server. And now it's saying from the action menu, select configure and enable routing and remote access. So I'm going to say configure and enable. Now I can now select which type of services I wish to provide. So remote access, so this is giving people the ability to connect in. Or I can say I want to provide network address translation. So this would allow internal clients on my network, on my intranet, to be able to go and access the internet using one public IP address. So if this machine was the machine that was connected to the internet, and I want to let all the internal people on my network talk to the internet, I would need to enable this network address translation, which would enable this server to take all those outgoing requests and basically funnel them out through its IP address. And then when the responses come back, it effectively has a lookup table that says, okay, this incoming connection is actually for this machine on my internal network. So it can provide those network address translation services if this is the gateway to the network, i.e. the internet, and has to basically talk on behalf of all the clients. I can say I want it to be VPN and NAT. Maybe I'm doing that site-to-site connectivity. But for right now, I'm just going to set up the remote access option. But do remember this network address translation. If this is the box that sits and connects to the internet, and you want to allow your internal clients to talk to the internet, and they don't have internet addresses, i.e. they just have your internal addresses, you have to enable that network address translation to enable them to talk to the internet. I want to say remote access. Am I supporting VPN? Yes. Am I supporting dial-up? Do I have a bank of modems? No. So I'm just saying a virtual private network. And now it's showing me, well, what are the network connections that I have available on this box? So this is now where we require those two adapters, one connected to the outside world and one connected to your internal intranet. Now for my lab example, limited is going to emulate talking to the internet. So that's going to be my external connectivity. And I'm going to say, yes, accept that default of letting it put as much security as possible on that connection. Remember, if this is the gateway into your company, you want to make it as sturdy as possible. Do you want to assign IP addresses to those remote clients? So yes, I want to give them an IP address based on my DHCP servers on my network. So I already have a DHCP server, so it can give me IP addresses to give to those clients. Now, if I did not have a DHCP service, or maybe this is in a DMZ and doesn't have access to a DHCP server, I can select the option to just define an address range, which I want to allocate to those VPN clients. Because remember what's happening here. This machine that is connecting in is sitting at home. It has a public IP address that's been given by their vendor, Verizon, AT&T, whoever. But that IP address is useless on your internal network. So when they establish a VPN connection, they create this secure tunnel between their machine and your intranet. But they need an IP address that is usable on that VPN connection. So they will be given an IP address for your internal network. So I'm going to say use DHCP. Are you using multiple remote access servers? And this is governing how am I going to authenticate those incoming users. If I had lots and lots of different remote access servers configured, I may want to set up a central server that's going to handle all that authentication. And this is known as a radius server. Windows Server 2012 fully supports being a radius server. And you'll actually see this in some other types of service. You may need to configure Windows as a radius server, for example, your wireless networks. When someone connects to your wireless network, you may want to authenticate them. And your wireless network may support radius, so you can set up almost your Active Directory to be that central authentication source via a sort of radius proxy or configure on another server. But I'm going to say, no, I'm just going to authenticate these locally. And then this is going to control how they're connecting. It's giving me the details. So I say finish. So this server is now configured. I can see the network interfaces that it's got configured and is using. I can see the ports that it's leveraging for all those different VPN connections. I don't have any clients. And in my firewall, I can see it's enabled ports for GRE-in, Layer 2 tunneling protocol, point-to-point tunneling protocol, and secure sockets layer tunneling protocol. So it's enabled all of those, so it's ready to receive those. I can customize my configuration. So I can right-click here and say Properties. Am I an IPv4 router or an IPv6? Which security do I wish to use? So EAP, MS Chat v2. So I'm actually just going to say MS Chat v2 for right now. I don't want to enable without authentication. Which certificate? So I've changed this from the default to that certificate I requested from my PKI server. So I want to match the certificate to the actual name of the machine. I don't want it self-signed. I can just see all the different options here. What do I want to log? Okay. So now if you make any changes, it's going to restart the service. Now, because I'm not using a network policy server right now, I need to give users the permission to connect. So if I go into Active Directory, and I'm going to look at my user account and say Properties, under Dial In, I know we're not really dialing in, but that's what it is, you need to make sure you've set it to Allow Access. So now I can actually go and connect in. So the next point would actually be to stand up a VPN client. On my client machine, I fired up Network and Sharing Center. I'm going to say set up a new connection. Now actually what I'm going to also do here, this machine has two network adapters. It's a virtual machine. So I want to disable the one that gives me normal connectivity to my corporate resources. So I can actually emulate I'm connecting via the VPN. So that intranet connection is now disabled. So I can prove this. If I try and ping my domain controller, it doesn't work anymore. If I look at my IP configuration, all I have is an IP address on that internal network. Now what I have done is I've actually configured my hosts file locally on this machine to have a connection for my Savdal Razo1 server so it can find basically the IP address of that name. So if I open this up in Notepad, you can see I added the IP address to my RAS server because it's just my lab environment. This isn't on the internet. It can't really resolve that name. But because it has a certificate, if I try to use 10.10.10.1, it wouldn't work because that does not match the name of the certificate. So I've added an entry in my host file. So now I need to go ahead and actually create a new connection. So I'm going to go back to my Network and Sharing Center and I want to set up a new connection. And this is a connection to a workplace. I'm going to use my internet connection. I don't need to set up a new connection. And who am I connecting to? So this is where I'm going to use that name that I defined in my host file. Again, you would not normally have to do this. As long as that server was addressable over the internet, it would be able to find it. But this wouldn't be in my lab environment. I'm going to say it's my Saviltech VPN, remember my credentials, and create. And there it is. I can now right click on this and look at the properties of this connection. So I have the options, I have what security. So use a certificate for that mutual authentication if I'm using layer 2 tunneling protocol. I can say which protocol. So I'm actually going to say use MS Chat v2. I could say, do I want to automatically use my currently logged on name? So yes, I'm going to use my currently logged on name. I can see the networking. I can see the type of VPN. So I might say, hey, I want to use secure sockets tunneling protocol rather than automatic. And click OK. I can now select this, click it, and say connect. So that's now connected through. So that ping that failed before, I should now be on the network, and I should have a new IP address. So there we can see I actually now have a connection using my PPP adapter on the VPN on that network. I should now be able to go and ping that server because I'm now effectively tunneled through. So that's actually now got me connected to my corporate resources. I could go and access my corporate SharePoint page, for example. And that just works. Even though I don't have any direct connectivity, I'm not sitting on the intranet, it now works because of that VPN connection. If I go back to my VPN server, I can now see, hey, I have a client connected. I'm not using network access protection, but I can see the duration, how many ports I'm using. I can see the status of the network, what IP address, just all the information. So I now have a VPN connection up and running using the inbox. And again, this is in a lab environment, but the exact same techniques would work actually out on the internet connecting into this server on the DMZ. This concludes the lesson on creating a VPN.